complex, complexity. Complexity seems to be the mantra of the 21st century. Have you noticed how everybody in authority, whether it's business or corporations or government at the local, state or federal level, keeps saying it's a complex problem? See, the problem with the word complex is that it basically atomizes the community. Because if something is complex, then only a few people are actually able to address the issue. Now, obviously, creating a nuclear bomb is complex, and building a 747 is complex, and building the weapons of destruction which we now have on the planet is complex. I mean, these are structural, scientific issues which need understanding and study. And obviously, individuals, apart from a select few who've done the necessary study, are not in a position to understand how these products are manufactured. We don't understand, the majority of us, how a car is manufactured, but the majority of people know how to drive a car. We don't understand how a building is constructed, but the majority of people live in buildings. When you seek medical attention, you may not understand the process which leads the medical practitioner to make a diagnosis by using a variety of instruments, whether it's blood tests, radiology, or more sophisticated investigations. But ultimately, at the end of the process, it's up to you whether you go ahead with the treatment or not, after you listen to the pros and cons of a various treatment. So obviously, living in the 21st century is complex, because we are surrounded by complex structures. But the fact is that it isn't complex to resolve the issues that we face on a day-to-day basis. It isn't a complex problem to resolve the issue of a lack of gas on the eastern seaboard of Australia, considering we're the second greatest gas exporter in the world. It isn't complex to ensure children receive a decent public education. It isn't complex to ensure that we have food security and people have a roof over their heads. What makes everything complex and incapable of change? And that's what they mean when something is complex. They're not talking about building a car or a building or a medical diagnosis or a medical treatment or forming pharmaceuticals, creating pharmaceuticals. They're talking about the fact that solving easily solvable problems have now become complex because of the structures that have been created around us to ensure that a small percentage of the population, the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, continue to dominate the decision-making processes in this country. And that's the issue. Who makes decisions? Why are they made? Who does it enrich? Who does it exclude? None of these are complex issues. These are simple issues. They've become complex and impossible in a significant proportion of cases for parliamentary legislation to address because of vested interests. And that's the key. We may have complex machinery, complex medications, but we shouldn't have a complex decision-making process which protects vested interests. So when you hear about the complex steps towards making a motor vehicle or a building or a bomb, it's totally different to the steps which are necessary to address significant day-to-day issues in our society. Vested interests is the key. Decision-making processes have become difficult because of vested interests. Now, the classical example is gas in this country, of availability of gas. Now, there is a gas shortage on the eastern seaboard of Australia. There isn't a gas shortage on the western part of Australia because the West Australian government took steps to ensure the interests of its residents were paramount in its decision-making processes and its interaction with gas-producing monopolies and duopolies. On the East Coast, it was a different matter. We allowed those vested interests to dominate the decision-making process. It's the same with renewable energy. Now, renewable energy is a no-brainer. A no-brainer. Whether you accept the science or not, it is a no-brainer that there are increasing numbers of so-called natural disasters which have been pushed along by human habitation on this planet, and the creation of the byproducts of human habitation has we moved from an agricultural to an industrial society. It's a no-brainer. So why is it so difficult to address the problem? And why are the institutions and structures which are being created to address the problem as far as renewable energy is concerned replicating the same institutions and structures which caused the problem in the first place? And the answer is, once again, vested interests. Of course, it's become complex to move from fossil fuels to renewable energy while vested interests in the fossil fuel industry continue to call the shots. The so-called debate we had for a decade about whether climate change was real or not was nothing more than stalling measures by vested interests. And that's the key. It's not complex. The decision-making process was simple. That if we wanted to survive, we needed to move forward to renewable energy. But obviously, vested interests held us back. It's the same with the fossil fuel production. Electricity from fossil fuel sources should have been set aside years ago, but it continues to flourish and prosper. And what's more disheartening is that we have reached a situation where we can wrest control of energy production, and energy production is fundamental in any post-industrial society because almost every aspect of our day-to-day living is dependent on energy. The problem is that we are now replicating the same structures which dominated the fossil fuel industries. Renewable energy lends itself to decentralised control, community control. But what we see in the renewable energy sector is the same corporations which dominated fossil fuels now moving into the renewable energy sector, creating the same centralised structures which ensure that vested interests continue to dominate every aspect of our day-to-day existence. Now let's move more into community and social issues. Now I know I say this every week, but 28 million people living on a resource-rich continent should not have the problems at a social level and community level that we seem to have in this country, and more importantly that we don't seem to have the ability to actually address these problems. How can you have 1/3 of the population living a hand-to-mouth existence on social security benefits while somebody is willing to pay $141 million for an apartment that hasn't even been built in central Sydney? And again, it's the triumph of vested interests over the needs of the population as a whole. It's about putting corporate interests before public interests. And the difference between corporate and public is very simple. Public is the many, corporate is the few. So we have allowed ourselves to create an economy which is dominated by a minuscule minority. We have the ludicrous situation of food being produced in Northern Australia. Food is sent to Brisbane and then Melbourne, then sent back to Brisbane and back to North Queensland, where it's double the price. Again, because we have allowed ourselves to create a centralised system of food production, food distribution. This is not complex. This is the logical endpoint of an economic system which is based on the concept of private investment for private profit, irrespective of the government regulations that are put in place to regulate the activities of duopolies and monopolies that have become too big to fail, dominate economic activity in this country on a day-to-day basis. We see the ludicrous situation of simple issues being turned into complex issue. It is not complex to resolving the problem of homelessness. It's not complex resolving the problem of housing affordability. It is simple. It's a matter of where investment is placed. It's a matter of having competition between the public sector and the private sector. And when you have no public sector, because it's been given away over the last 50 years in an orgy of privatisation, you dramatically decrease competition and increased profits for a shrinking minority of corporations. All you have to do is walk into a temple of consumption. That's right. Our churches and mosques and synagogues and temples are falling apart. They're empty. But any weekend or any day, go to any major shopping centre, any temple of consumption, a postmodern temple of consumption, and you will see the same brands everywhere. Nothing highlights this than the fact that governments at the state and federal level has allowed Uber to come into our country and destroy small businesses which have been created over generations of work. So it is simple, it's not complex. Obviously, it's difficult and complex to push people out of positions of authority, to attack and neutralise vested interests. It's difficult. But the problems we face today are not complex problems. They are simple problems which can be resolved if we have the political, social, cultural will to resolve these problems. And the only way we will have that will, that energy, that power, is by highlighting that complexity has nothing to do with resolving the social, economic issues that we face today as a society. This is not a poor sovereign nation state. The dispossession of this country's First Nations people in the most brutal fashion has created institutions that are swimming in profits. We see this in agriculture, where less than 100,000 people involved in agriculture are now feeding over 100 million people on the planet in this country. It's not complex, it's simple. What is complex is destroying the structures which protect vested interests in this country. What is complex is having representatives in Parliament who are willing to point out these vested interests. But unfortunately, in a parliamentary democracy where the fourth estate is dead, dodo dead, we have no mechanism via which to keep them to account. And obviously, as we run from one job to another, as we're busy doing nothing except maintaining our sanity in this complex society where simple tasks have become unbearably complex, we will find that their power will continue to grow at our expense. So don't be confused. Don't be resigned to the fact that change is not possible. When somebody talks about complex issues, complex solutions, tell them, what are they talking about? Why are they complex? It's not about manufacturing things. It's about creating the intellectual, cultural, political space where simplicity is highlighted because there are no vested interests to protect. You know, people talk about words, because words are powerful. They are powerful, and we see words, you know, we see people using different words. And I've seen over the last few years the word complex being used by corporations and politicians to absolve themselves of responsibilities for their actions. And that's the issue. They hide behind that mask of complexability. There is no complexability. All there are problems, and all we need a simple solution to these problems, and these simple solutions can only be implemented by the sidelining of vested interests by a minuscule minority.